The lawyer's voice was calm, almost bored, as he read the list aloud. Checking account frozen. Savings account frozen. Certificate of deposit frozen. All assets under conservatorship pending medical evaluation. He glanced up at the three people sitting across from him, and none of them looked remotely concerned. Any questions? Diane shook her head, already checking her phone. Marcus leaned back in his chair, arms folded. And Patricia, the oldest, simply said, "How long until we can access everything?" The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "Once the courts approve the conservatorship, you'll have full control. Shouldn't be more than a few weeks." What none of them knew, what nobody in that sterile office could have guessed, was that their mother, 79-year-old Ruth Brennan, had spent the last 40 years protecting something they had never thought to ask about. Something that existed far beyond the reach of any court order, any frozen account, any legal document they could sign. And the moment they discovered it, everything they thought they had secured would unravel completely. 6 weeks earlier, Ruth Brennan had been living alone in the same modest two-bedroom house she'd occupied for nearly 5 decades. The neighborhood had changed around her, younger families moving in, old friends passing on or relocating to be closer to their children. But Ruth stayed, tending her small garden, walking to the corner store twice a week, keeping to herself in the way people do when they've learned that independence is something you protect quietly. Her children visited rarely. Diane lived 2 hours away, managing a marketing firm that consumed most of her time. Marcus worked overseas, returning to the States only for major holidays. And Patricia, though she lived in the same city, always seemed to have scheduling conflicts that kept her just out of reach. Ruth told herself it didn't matter. She had raised them, given them good lives, and now they had their own. That was natural. That was how things worked. But what none of them noticed during their brief, distracted visits was how carefully Ruth managed everything. How she kept her bills paid on time, her pantry organized, her mind sharp with crossword puzzles and library books. How she remembered every birthday, every anniversary, every small detail about their lives that they barely remembered sharing with her. Until the fall. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Ruth was reaching for a mixing bowl on the top shelf when the dizziness hit, sudden and overwhelming. The room tilted sharply, and the next thing she remembered was lying on the kitchen floor, staring up at the ceiling light, unable to make her left arm move the way it should. A neighbor found her 3 hours later, alerted by the fact that Ruth's morning newspaper was still sitting on the front porch well past noon. The ambulance came quickly. The hospital ran tests. The doctors used words like transient ischemic attack and moderate stroke, and significant recovery possible with therapy. But by the time Ruth was stable enough to ask questions, her children had already made decisions. Patricia arrived first, her expression tight with what might have been worry or might have been inconvenience. "Mom, you can't live alone anymore. You know that, right?" Ruth, still weak and slurring slightly, tried to explain that she would get better, that she just needed time. But Patricia had already moved on to logistics, talking about facilities, about care options, about what made sense. When Diane and Marcus arrived 2 days later, the conversation was already over. They stood in Ruth's hospital room, the three of them forming a wall of shared certainty, and explained what would happen next. "We found a place," Diane said. "It's clean, well-staffed. You'll be safe there." Ruth's voice came out quieter than she wanted. "What about my house?" "We'll handle it," Marcus said, in the same tone he used during business calls. "Everything will be taken care of." The nursing home was 40 minutes outside the city, a low brick building surrounded by flat, featureless lawn. Ruth's room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a single chair, and a window that looked out at the parking lot. The staff was polite but busy, always moving on to the next resident before Ruth could finish a sentence. She asked about going home. They told her the doctors would evaluate her progress. She asked about her house. They told her to focus on recovery. And when she asked if her children were coming to visit, the nurse smiled kindly and said, "I'm sure they'll be by when they can." But weeks passed, and none of them came. What Ruth didn't know yet was that 3 days after she'd been moved, Patricia had contacted a lawyer. Within a week, her children had filed for emergency conservatorship, citing her stroke and her age as evidence that she could no longer manage her own affairs. The petition was granted with minimal scrutiny. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her mail was forwarded to Patricia's address. And the small house on Maple Street, the one Ruth had lived in for half a century, was quietly listed for sale. Everything Ruth had built, everything she had saved, was now out of her hands. Or at least, that's what her children believed. Because what they didn't know, what they had never thought to ask about, was what Ruth had been protecting all those years she lived alone in that unremarkable house. Something she had inherited long before they were born. Something she had kept deliberately separate from everything else. Something that would change everything the moment they finally discovered it existed. The first time Ruth asked to see her bank statements, the nursing home administrator gave her a sympathetic smile and said the request would need to go through her conservator. When Ruth asked who that was, the woman checked her file and said, "Your daughter, Patricia." Ruth called Patricia that afternoon from the communal phone in the hallway. It took 3 tries before anyone answered. "Mom, I'm in a meeting. I need to see my account information," Ruth said, keeping her voice steady. There was a pause. "Why?" "Because it's my money." Another pause, longer this time. "Mom, the accounts are frozen for your protection." The lawyer explained this. "Once everything is settled, you'll get a monthly allowance for personal expenses." "An allowance," Ruth repeated. "It's standard procedure. I have to go." The line went dead before Ruth could respond. She stood there for a long moment, the phone still pressed to her ear, feeling something shift inside her. Not panic, not anger, something colder and more clarifying. They thought they had taken everything. That night, Ruth sat in her small room and did something she hadn't done in years. She wrote a letter, not to her children, but to someone she hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Someone who would understand exactly what needed to happen next. 2 weeks later, a man in his 60s appeared at the nursing home's front desk, asking to see Ruth Brennan. He introduced himself as Thomas Collier, an attorney from the next county over. The staff hesitated until he produced documentation proving he had represented Ruth for years on a separate matter, one unrelated to her current conservatorship. When he entered Ruth's room, she was sitting by the window, her posture straighter than it had been in weeks. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, closing the door behind him. "Mr. Collier." Ruth gestured to the chair. "Thank you for coming." He sat, opening his briefcase and removing a thick folder. "I was surprised to get your letter. I hadn't heard from you since we finalized the trust." "I didn't think I'd need to contact you again," Ruth said quietly. "But circumstances have changed." Thomas nodded slowly. "Your children don't know about the property. They never asked." He flipped through the documents, his expression thoughtful. "The farmland has been in your family for 3 generations. Your father transferred it to you in 1978, and you placed it in an irrevocable trust in 1995. Your children aren't beneficiaries, and they're not named anywhere in the documentation." "Correct. The trust specifies that upon your death, the land goes to charity. Until then, all proceeds from the agricultural lease go directly into the trust account." He looked up. "They can't touch any of it. The conservatorship doesn't extend to assets held in irrevocable trusts." Ruth's hands, resting in her lap, relaxed slightly. "How much is it worth now?" Thomas didn't hesitate. "Current market value, approximately $4.2 million. Annual income from the farming lease is roughly $80,000. The number hung in the air between them. "They think I have nothing," Ruth said. "They think you had nothing worth protecting," Thomas corrected gently. "There's a difference." Over the next hour, they went through everything. The trust was airtight. The land, 200 acres of prime farmland an hour south of the city, had been leased to the same farming family for 30 years. The income had been quietly deposited into the trust account every year, accumulating steadily, never touched. Ruth had never mentioned it to her children because her parents had taught her a simple lesson. You don't tell people about money unless you trust them to value you more than it. And somewhere along the way, watching her children grow into adults who called less and visited rarely, Ruth had realized that particular trust had never developed. "What do you want to do?" Thomas asked finally. Ruth looked out the window at the empty parking lot. "I want to go home." "To the house on Maple Street?" "They're selling it," Ruth said. "Patricia told me last week. She said it was for the best." Thomas made a note. "The house is part of the frozen estate, which means the sale requires court approval. I can challenge it." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that the conservatorship was established under questionable circumstances. You had a minor stroke, Mrs. Brennan, not a cognitive collapse. You can speak, reason, and make decisions. A judge might find the conservatorship excessive." Ruth considered this. "And if we win?" "The conservatorship gets dissolved. Your accounts get unfrozen. You regain control of your life. He paused. And your children find out that all of this was unnecessary. They'll ask about money, Ruth said. Probably. And when they find out about the farmland? Thomas closed the folder carefully. That depends on what you want them to know. For the first time in weeks, Ruth smiled. It was a small expression, barely there, but it carried a weight that hadn't existed before. I think, she said slowly, it's time they learned that I've been taking care of myself just fine. The hearing took place on a Thursday morning in a courthouse that smelled like floor polish and old paper. Ruth sat beside Thomas Collier, her hands folded in her lap, while across the aisle Patricia, Diane, and Marcus whispered with their attorney. The judge, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and no patience for theatrics, reviewed the file in silence before looking up. This is a petition to dissolve the conservatorship established over Mrs. Ruth Brennan. Mr. Collier, you're representing the respondent. Yes, Your Honor. And you're arguing that the conservatorship was unnecessary? I am. The judge turned to Patricia's attorney. You filed the original petition. What's your position now? The man stood, straightening his tie. Your Honor, Mrs. Brennan suffered a significant stroke. Her children acted out of genuine concern for her welfare. She was living alone, and they felt, I'm asking what your position is now, the judge interrupted. Not 6 weeks ago. He hesitated. We believe the conservatorship remains in her best interest. Based on what current evidence? There was no answer. The judge looked at Ruth. Mrs. Brennan, do you understand why we're here today? Yes, Your Honor. Do you feel capable of managing your own affairs? Ruth met her eyes directly. I've been managing my own affairs for 79 years. I'd like to continue. The judge made a note, then gestured to Thomas. Proceed. What followed was brief and methodical. Thomas presented medical records showing Ruth's recovery had been strong. He introduced statements from the nursing home staff confirming her mental clarity. He pointed out that no cognitive assessment had been conducted before the conservatorship was granted, and that the original petition had relied solely on the stroke itself as justification. Your Honor, Thomas said finally, Mrs. Brennan had a medical event. She did not lose her capacity to make decisions. This conservatorship was premature at best and punitive at worst. Patricia's attorney tried to argue that the family had acted in good faith, but the judge cut him off. Good faith doesn't override legal standards, she said. The burden of proof in conservatorship cases is high for a reason. She looked at Patricia, Diane, and Marcus. Did any of you visit your mother after she was placed in the facility? The silence that followed was answer enough. The judge closed the file. The conservatorship is dissolved effective immediately. Mrs. Brennan's accounts will be unfrozen, and her authority over her own affairs is fully restored. She paused. I'm also ordering that any sale of her property be halted pending her review. Ruth exhaled slowly. Outside the courthouse, Patricia approached first, her expression tight. Mom, we were trying to help. You were trying to manage me, Ruth said quietly. There's a difference. Diane stepped forward. We didn't know you were recovering so well. If we had. You didn't ask, Ruth interrupted. Not once. Marcus, who had been silent the entire time, finally spoke. What happens now? Ruth looked at the three of them, these people she had raised, and felt a strange mixture of sadness and clarity. Now I go home, to my house, and I decide what happens next. We were going to use the money from the house to pay for your care, Patricia said, an edge in her voice now. I don't need your help paying for anything. Patricia frowned. Mom, you don't have $4.2 million in farmland, Ruth said calmly. Held in an irrevocable trust since before you graduated high school. The words landed like stones in water. Diane's mouth opened slightly. Marcus just stared. Patricia's face went through several expressions before settling on disbelief. You never told us, Patricia said finally. You never asked what I had, Ruth replied. You only assumed what I didn't. She turned and walked toward Thomas's car, her steps steady, her head high. 3 months later, Ruth Brennan stood in the kitchen of her house on Maple Street, sunlight streaming through the window. She had cleaned that morning. The rooms were exactly as she had left them. The garden had been overgrown, but she was working on it, a little each day. Her children had called a few times, tentative and uncertain. She had answered, kept the conversations brief, and made no promises about what their relationship would look like going forward. That would take time, and it would require something they hadn't shown before. effort that wasn't conditional on what they thought she could give them. The farmland remained in the trust, untouched, still generating income that accumulated quietly. Ruth had updated the terms to include a small provision. Upon her death, a portion would go to a scholarship fund for elderly individuals seeking legal help with family disputes. Because Ruth had learned something important in those weeks when everything had been taken from her. Dignity wasn't something other people granted you. It was something you protected, quietly and carefully, long before anyone thought to take it away. And sometimes the strongest thing you could do wasn't fight back loudly. It was simply to stand up, reclaim what had always been yours, and walk forward on your own terms.